Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back down under the mat. We're here today to discuss that Vince McMahon Netflix documentary.
That documentary.
There's a lot of speculation going around about it at the moment. I myself have not had the chance to watch it yet, but Dan's binged it. He's watched the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be leading this, so I'm going to hand it over to Dan, and we'll get the discussion flowing.
Oh, I'll be the master of ceremonies for you then, Reece.
You shall be. I got the introduction done. That's my job done.
Yeah, great. You're out. Sweet. I think the point for this, obviously, is the doco's out on Netflix. It's a 6-episode docuseries on Mr. McMahon.
That's easily bingeable.
It was. I started it one night, watched 4 episodes of it, and then finished the next 2 the next day whilst I was diligently working. So that was, it was done in 24 hours. Obviously, the context behind it that you obviously need to know is it was about Mr. McMahon, Vincent K. McMahon.
Nice. I thought it was going to be about Bret Hart.
We'll talk to him. But a lot of the interviews and stuff that they clearly put this up throughout the documentary is that a lot of this was filmed pre-2021 or 2022. Yep. So all of these interviews were filmed before the Wall Street Journal released the most recent claims against Vince McMahon and him retiring and leaving the WWE.
Pre-Endeavour merge as well.
Yes. So there is some stuff from in the last episode or so around from 2023 onwards.
Okay.
Where they go back and talk to people from the Wall Street Journal. They have some additional comments from Bruce Pritchard. They get him back in to have a little chat.
Yep.
But Vince himself doesn't come back after all the allegations, and obviously
not surprising.
You know, the other characters that they talk to, your Rocks, your Undertakers, your Stone Colds, your John Cenas, don't talk about that. So if your context is I want to understand this Janelle Grant lawsuit and what trouble Vince is in right now, this is not going to cover it. It does, like I said, it covers in the last episode the Wall Street Journal and that claim, but kind of that's it. There's not really much more to it.
Yeah, okay.
This is much more of a historic documentary on all of the other things that Vince and the WWF and WWE have done.
Okay.
So, you obviously haven't watched it.
No.
I don't want to spoil all of the things for you. It is definitely still go back and watch it.
Yeah.
But I do want to
I've already penned that time in with my partner, Annie. Tuesday night, we're going to start watching it.
I do want to comment on, obviously, some of the broader things and then see if I can get your reactions on me telling you some fun stories out of it. So it starts with the life of Vince, right? And how, you know, as a child, he didn't know his dad for his first 12 years.
Wow.
Yeah, he didn't know that yet.
12 years?
He grew up in a trailer park with his mum. Didn't know who his dad was.
Righto. There's the start to the maniacal character.
And then, you know, when Vince Senior comes in, he obviously has the wrestling business and stuff. Vince loves that. They don't really bond father and son. Vince very clearly says, you know, we never threw catch, we never did that sort of stuff, but we talked business and we talked wrestling. And that's kind of how Vince grew up.
Yeah.
And then it goes through, you know, how he went and his father was very strong in pioneering the territory system for WWE, and they had the northeast of America, so like all the New York, Boston, Jersey sort of area and all the other territories. And then when Vince took over the business, when his father sort of got old enough and Vince bought him out, so him and Linda essentially took a mortgage and loans out to buy out his dad.
Yep.
A very big risk at the time. Then Vince went and took all of the stars from all the other territories and essentially got rid of the territory system, then created the WWF and made wrestling what it is today.
Yep.
One of the first things that you take out of this is that Vince is probably a very strong hypocrite, and he doesn't. There's a couple of times in this doco where he will say to you and to the camera that Vincent McMahon and the character of Mr. McMahon, 2 different people.
Yeah. I've already seen comparisons where it's like he'll say that and then it will cut to someone else and they'll be like, they're the same person.
Everybody says it's the same person. Bruce Pritchard is probably the one that gives you the most realistic.
Yeah.
And there's a really fun story with that where Bruce is like, it's pretty much the same guy. Like Vince is Vince, right? And Stone Cold is like, I couldn't tell the difference. HBK, it's the same man. And even Hulk Hogan was like, you couldn't tell the difference, right? But what Bruce Pritchard, when he comes, we're going all over the place here, but it's fine. Bruce Pritchard in the last episode comes back and says, look, I've watched your first couple episodes of this doco, and I don't think it's fair the way that you've treated Vince, You've tried to
Right.
really target him and make him out to be a bad guy. That's not who Vince as a person is.
Okay.
Because my wife had cancer. And when she had cancer, she was given 6 months to live. And that was 24 years ago. Because Vince paid for her to get the best medical attention ever. Vince looked after me, he looked after my family, and he did that for so many people. Which is an interesting insight.
Yeah, because
You don't get that from anyone else.
Yeah, and like especially when like they've painted it the picture to be Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon are the same character, and they have all those testimonies from everyone afterwards saying that. That is a distinct characteristic that would not be
Yes,
done
absolutely.
from Mr. McMahon.
Yep. And so you could probably, and I mean, you get some stuff from Shane and from Triple H and stuff about, you know, the good side of what Vince is as a person. But the general consensus is that the Mr. McMahon character on TV is Vince turned up to 11. Right?
Yeah, and that's something that I've heard from The Rock as well. Like whether it was true or not, because it was in Fighting With My Family, the movie about Paige, and like they had the little backstage segment. And he's like, The Rock is just Dwayne Johnson, just turned up to 11. That's what I always assumed Mr. McMahon was as a character. It was just Vince turned up, because that's essentially what they do in this business. They find their own niche personality that may be somewhat attached to their actual personality, and then they just ramp that up.
The first couple of episodes are obviously around the early times of WWF, so the 80s, 90s, creating the product of what it was.
Yep.
The whole WCW saga and era and the steroids drama.
Yeah, I've seen some stuff about the
There's a lot on
steroid stuff so far.
The one comment that a lot of people have taken out of it, while saying Vince is a bit hypocritical, is he essentially calls out Ted Turner and says, and I think I've got his quote because I didn't save the points here.
We got some quotes. Love a good quote.
Vince said, Ted Turner wants to hurt the business. I want to compete. So that was in context to when WCW was buying the talent. They bought Razor Ramon, they bought Nash, we bought Hogan.
Well, like throughout the years, we have heard so much negativity around how much those like guaranteed money contracts affected the business.
Oh, absolutely.
So it kind of makes sense that Vince would come out and say like that's what Ted Turner's goal was to hurt the business.
And then when you look at hypocritically what Vince did in the 80s by going to every territory and taking Roddy Piper and taking Hulk Hogan and taking Andre the Giant, that wasn't competing. That was hurting the business.
That was literally killing all the competition and making the giant of
That's
WWF.
not how Vince tries to spin it. Vince tries to spin it that Ted Turner was the big billionaire company thing that was crushing him, and Vince was the small family business.
Right.
Mate, that's very interesting.
That's hypocritical for sure.
The next part, the next comment that I put down here, and it's further in. I'm sort of just picking different parts.
That's all right. As long as it flows, mate.
Shane McMahon.
Right. Oh, here we go.
You get a lot of stuff with Shane, and there's a bit of a continuity between Vince and his dad, and the way that he had to earn his respect, and Shane and Vince, and how Shane has to earn his respect.
Yeah, as soon as you mentioned that history with Vince and his father, Vince Senior, I figured that would sort of play into the factor into the relationship between Vince and Shane as well.
And then there's a lot of stuff from the family side of things where they start talking about how Triple H, Paul Levesque was the one that seemed to be leading towards taking over the business. It wasn't Shane. And when they were picking, when Vince was choosing, it was always that Shane was the second option, was Stephanie was the first option. So there's always that family tension. Paul Heyman on this has a very, very fun story.
Ooh.
Where
Paul's always got good stories, man.
Oh, and the way Paul tells it, it's perfect. So Shane says that when he was growing up with Vince, they used to like play wrestle, right? And what Vince used to do would be like pinch or grab at his stomach and his ribs and roll him around and then pin him. And then Shane would be like, you can't do that. And Vince says to him, that's what I do. I cheat and I win. And so that's kind of his mantra. And that's what Shane grows up.
That paints a whole picture.
Does it? What?
Jesus.
And so then, Heyman's telling the story about how Shane was trying to pitch an idea, and Vince just said,
"Yeah, I've heard this story."
And Vince just says, "Nah, it's not my story."
Nah, over my dead body.
Pretty much. Yep. So he says, "Yeah, over my dead body," and so then you think that's where it ends. Like that's pretty callous.
Yeah.
It's not. It's not. So then Vince hands Shane a knife.
Oh.
And tells him, if you want to do it, stab me in the chest.
Right.
If you like that idea much, stab me in the chest. And his quote is, and if you don't do it then, I know you're not man enough to do it. and I have to take that into consideration as well. Or, he said, you could buy me out, like I bought out my father. And if I don't get out of the way, be prepared to get rid of me the way I would have had to get rid of my father if he wasn't doing it the way I wanted it.
Jesus Christ.
So, a lot in the
This guy.
A lot of the doco is him trying to paint himself as a businessman and his love for the wrestling business, right?
Yeah, okay.
So everything is a business decision. He talks about the death of Owen, right? And how Owen dies, and it's then on Vince, does the show go on, right? And his wording, and whether he's hiding behind it or not, is a bit iffy, says that as a businessman, the show must go on. The crowd did not see him die, right? So if you know the context from Over the Limit, he obviously falls from the rafters and hits the ring. And
Gets stretchered out.
But it was pre-show, so it was when he was getting set up for it. So he died before the actual event had happened.
Oh, I never knew that. Yeah. I thought it was during the show.
No, the crowd won't. Like, it's not like the crowd were watching this guy do not fall and die.
Right, okay.
But, like, there was people in the building.
Yeah,
everything was on. Like, it was there, but it was not broadcast as far as we were on the paper.
Right, okay.
So Vince had to decide, do we keep going or not?
So it was like during a practice run?
It was, setting him up to the top.
Yeah,
right?
okay, cool. Gotcha.
And so then Vince says, look, we have to keep going, right? And he says that if it had happened to me, if it had happened to Shane, had happened to anybody else, if the show must go on. If the crowd if the crowd saw someone fall and die,
that's another story.
We have to stop this, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't. And so that's where he's copped a lot of flack in, looking back at it, was because that, a lot of people said, hey, a man died. You should probably have not done your wrestling show.
Yeah.
And, they show JR and King talking about how they have to sadly tell the pay-per-view crowd that, Owen Hart has died. He's been pronounced dead. And they tell that to the people that are watching, but everybody in the building don't know. So the rest of the show happens, and there's this footage of The Rock walking along the side of the ring, and there's a pile of blood on the edge of the red blood marks on the edge.
Yeah, I've seen those pictures. Yeah.
And the crowd don't know. The crowd are just cheering. They're watching the pay-per-view. Everything happens. It is like Val Venus does his sexy thing and stuff in the middle of the ring. And you look at it now, and that's just horrible to think. But at that point in time, as a businessman,
crowd did not know.
Decision.
Yeah.
Crowd don't know. Nothing's going to happen. We have to continue, because otherwise, how do you call off a pay-per-view event that at the point in time millions of people would have paid pay-per-view dollars for?
Yeah.
Bars, country places, movie theaters would have been set up for it. And then say, a man has died here as an accident, and then we have to sort of pull it out.
And you paint that picture of Vince always being business forefront of his mind, and the show must go on. Otherwise you lose millions and millions of dollars. And as a businessman, I can kind of see the logic why Vince would make that sort of decision, whether it was right or wrong.
Yeah, he justifies it. Yeah. The next sort of decision on that is the Montreal the Montreal Screwjob.
Yes.
And we obviously all know the story around how this happened. There was obviously Bret Hart was your champion at the time. He was the one that they'd built the WWF around. Shawn Michaels was a dirtbag. Nobody really liked him. He was a party kid, did all the drugs. He didn't like people backstage. He was a real smartass, but he was very, very talented. And so the feud was between the two of those, and Bret had signed with WCW and was leaving, and so Vince had said, well, cool, you got to drop the belt to Bret.
Yeah.
To Shawn. And Bret said,
do the job on the way out.
I won't. I'll do the job. I won't do it to Shawn. And so they kind of got backed into a wall of how this is going to get done. And so what they'd kind of planned was that what Vince had thought up until the week of was, we're going to just have a melee. We're just going to have everyone come into the ring. Everything's going to go crazy. We'll call off the match, because they booked themselves into the corner. They booked Bret versus Shawn, and Bret was not going to take the pin, right? And so they were like, well, if Bret's not going to stay on his back, how do I do this? We'll call off the match. We'll make it a big melee. We'll strip him of the title. We'll do all that sort of stuff. And in this doco, they go and they have a word with Mr. Paul Levesque, Triple H. And
Papa H.
There was a secret phone call on the night before between HBK, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and Vince McMahon.
Yeah.
And Vince says, hey, look, he's not going to do it. It's not going to happen. He's not going to take the pin. So we're going to have to, we'll do this melee thing. And Triple H pretty much says, fuck off. No, we don't.
Yep.
You go and tell him, if he's not going to go out on his back, make him go out on his back. And so that's kind of what gets Vince's ideas ticking of how they're going to do the screw job. And so then Vince, when they call it, makes sure that when the match happens, he's at the ring and he's ringside and he's there so Brett can see his face. And so the second we all know what happens in the screw job, puts him into the sharpshooter, the referee looks, rings the bell, he hasn't tapped, he gets super mad, Brett destroys the whole thing, but Vince is there staring him face to face to prove I did this.
Yeah.
I took my title back because Vince had said, you can leave my company, but you're not taking my property with you.
Yeah.
And then there's another story that happens from that afterwards where Brett's obviously pissed. And then they all go and like...
When isn't Bret Hart pissed?
His wife is yelling at Shawn Michaels, being like, you did this, you screwed this, and blah, blah. And Shawn's like, look, on God's name, I didn't know. I had nothing to do with this. I swear to God. And then she's like, oh, God will strike you down because you're lying. And so him and Triple H had to like deny this for 20, 30 years, that they did not have anything to do with this. It was all Vince's decision. And then the story goes that Vince walks into the locker room with his hands down, walks straight up to Brett, knowing that he's got a copper receipt, right?
Yeah.
Brett deserves it. I've screwed him over. Brett deserves something, and lets Brett just punch him square in the head. And Vince says he cracked him with one of the hardest punches he's ever had, square in the temple, like knocked him out, just banged down.
Yeah.
Brett tells the story that, that's bullshit. That's not how this happened. Vince walks into me getting all aggressive, runs up in my face. We lock up in wrestling style, and then I uppercut him. And I was like, that sounds dumb. And then you look at the footage that they show you from the next day on Raw, and when they interview Vince about the screw job,
Yeah.
Vince has a big black eye. You don't get a black eye from an uppercut.
No.
So I think that story, maybe Vince's side was a bit more accurate than what Brett's was. And the fact that...
Not very often we're going to side with Vince these days.
No, absolutely not. There's very few things in this documentary that makes you want to think that. But then the Brett thing, back to the Owen Hart part, where there's a comment that Brett makes where he's like, I think Vince killed Owen to get back at me. And I was like, whoa. And he's like, they were burying him in terms of his character and stuff because he leaves. And Vince just said, why the fuck? Like, Vince's response to that was, that's all Brett's ego.
Yeah.
Because why would we care what Brett thinks when Brett has left our company and we're not trying to do anything for him? We were trying to make Owen a star. This was a complete accident. And it was. If you watch the doco, it is 1,000% proven to be accurate that it was an accident. It was to do with the harness. The harness was not, functionally cleared. It didn't work properly. It broke. It was a complete accident. But for Brett to even contemplate putting that on there, that was, look, that one.
Vince is a maniacal, egotistical, chauvinistic pig, right?
Yes.
All the information we found out, we can conclude that is the case with Vince McMahon.
Yep.
I don't think murderer is something that he would be associated with. Like, that's a bit of a stretch.
Look, for that one, definitely not. Look, I'm gonna wrap up some other things because I recommend everyone goes and watches it and have some input.
I can't
Obviously,
wait.
I want Reece to really
just with this, like, I can't wait to watch this.
A couple of other points. There's obviously a lot of talk around the steroid trial and how that goes down. And essentially, a lot of the guys from the 80s, like my favorite characters, one of the five people on this is Tony Atlas. He is so unfiltered when he answers any of the questions. He is brilliant, and he just talks about, we were all on steroids. Absolutely, we were doing it. And then Hulk Hogan was on steroids. All the wrestlers back then were. Obviously, Hulk then went into bat to Vince, and the court case got thrown out. They go into a lot of detail on that. And Tony Atlas is like, I gave Hulk steroids all the time, 100%. We all did it. It's very, very interesting seeing that.
I mean,
side
I guess
of
we
it.
can't argue that point anymore, can we?
No, you can't. No, you look at the rest, and like the documentary is very well done, and Netflix is very good at doing these sort of docuseries where they portray it. They very clearly show you the like WWF in 1985 or whenever it is, right? And it's like the Bushwhackers and these big, like larger than life men, the Dusty Rhodeses and things like that rotting in the ring. And then they cut to a year later, and it's like Macho Man,
Hulk Hogan,
Warrior, and Hulk Hogan, and they're ripped as
Superstar
shit,
Billy
muscles
Graham.
everywhere. You're like, okay, I can see where the steroids come into this. There's a couple of points that I didn't anticipate. So they talk about the Chris Benoit stuff. No, we'll leave Pat Patterson touching people's peckers out. Go find that one out yourself. They talk about Chris Benoit.
Yeah, I've heard that they've discussed this in length. So
there is
pumped for that.
Episode 5, or I think it's 5 or 6, one of the last ones, where they talk about CTE, right?
Yeah.
Stone Cold does not believe in CTE.
Yeah, I have heard that.
Yep. Didn't.
That's a. I don't really want to touch that.
He doesn't agree with it. Undertaker has a very differing opinion on it. Undertaker comes in and says that, when that happened and they made changes to the business, like cutting out chair shots to the head and stuff, Undertaker was really mad. And he's like, I like chair shots to the head. It's part of our business. It's what we do.
Yeah.
And then one thing that they then talk about with The Undertaker is the streak.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
I thought you'd like this part of the story. So they talk about the streak, and essentially, Undertaker was going over.
Yeah. All the time.
Yep.
Every time.
Until the morning of.
Oh, for WrestleMania 30?
Yep. And Vince calls him and says, hey, I think Brock wins. I want to put Brock over tonight. And Undertaker's not sure about it because he thinks,
Was Paul right?
What?
Everybody's seen that promo that he cut at the convention about the fact that, like, if Brock wanted to take the streak, he could just do it.
Yeah.
Continue with your story.
The point of it was that morning, Vince made the decision that Brock was going over. And so Undertaker accepted that because
it's business.
It's business, 100%. He's one of the people that understands business, and if Vince thinks, like, at that time, Vince knows business better than anybody. If Vince thinks that's the right decision, that's the right decision. But then Mark / Undertaker talks about how he cops his concussion.
Yeah.
And he doesn't remember.
Doesn't know.
He doesn't remember, even to this day. He doesn't remember having that match. Right. Yeah. Vince McMahon then goes and says, I don't think he had a concussion. I think that was the trauma of The Undertaker losing that match. That's why he can't remember it.
Righto.
So there's a lot of intricacies here around the concussions and stuff, and who doesn't believe things. Very interesting takes.
Yeah. I can't wait to start this, dude. I can't wait.
What else do they get into? They talk a lot about. The other one I was going to touch on with you before. Trish Stratus.
Patricia Tredigius?
Yeah, sure, whatever her real name is. It's hilarious. That's what it is. But they talk to her because obviously they talk around the WWE, WF, whatever, going through now the Attitude Era and how that was, how it didn't treat women very well, the Ruthless Aggression Era, and then how they treated women, and then now it comes out towards the end that women can now wrestle and are actual characters, right? They talk a lot around Linda and that storyline with Trish being his
puppy dog or whatever.
Yeah, where he walks around and makes it bark like a dog, right? Yeah. And they show it, and she talks about it. And she says, look, hindsight terrible, but, we got it at the time. We were doing it to try and get a reaction from the crowd and get the buy-in to people to provide sympathy to me. And it worked.
Yeah.
Because you think about that character of Trish, that months before that, she was making out with Vince in front of Linda in a wheelchair. What I didn't know from all that, Shane was the most against it. Shane hated that idea. Nothing to do with it.
Don't blame him.
Shane always said, I don't want my mother on TV. And Linda was never a strong proponent in being a TV character, but she knew that, if it worked and the whole family was now characters, then I probably have to be one too.
Yeah, okay.
What I didn't pick was that she was the one that was helping with the story for Trish. So there was a scene where...
Is she a cuck?
There was a scene. There was one of the things they cut. I think it was a Valentine's Day or something, where Linda was in the wheelchair by the pool at their McMahon house.
Yeah.
And they give her flowers for Valentine's Day, and Trish gives it to her, and then Trish really creepily walks up and kisses her on the forehead. Says thanks, Linda, and then she grabs the flowers and walks away with Vince. That was Linda's idea. Linda said to Trish, "This would be really worse if you kissed me."
Right, okay.
So, for everyone that thinks that Vince is a horrible human being putting all this stuff together, he was. But the whole family were in on it, and they all knew that at the end of the day, they're TV characters.
Yeah, and it's business. Again, it's coming up a lot. It's business. So whatever you get to get the crowd invested and on board and getting reactions, it's shown time and time again that it pays off.
Correct. That was one of the things that I didn't anticipate.
No.
How much Linda was involved in it.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I did that. That's crazy. Have you heard of Phil Mushnick?
Yeah, the name sounds familiar.
So he was the New York Post columnist that essentially tried to bury the WWF all through the 90s.
Right, okay.
He was the only person that was ever writing stuff about him, and he obviously hates Vince. Vince hates him. He's interviewed a lot on this.
Oh, okay.
Early on, for the early on stuff. Because he was the one guy who put the steroid trial, the ring boy stuff, the Jimmy Snuka stuff, all that into the actual media. Because at the time in the 90s, pro wrestling was a farce. It was a carnival act.
Yeah.
So it wasn't going in the newspapers because it wasn't real sport.
Right.
He was the one guy that was doing it. So there's comments here about how, he was always reporting on those scandals at the time when the media didn't really care about it. And so the Netflix people eventually, they talked to Vince about it, and he said he was just trying to bury me the whole time. And then they interviewed Phil Mushnick, and they said, why were you so consistently picking on Vince and trying to get through this with the WWF in the 90s? And Phil's words are, it's because he's a dirtbag.
Can't fault him.
He's like, yeah, he is.
Yep.
So yeah, that's there's a fair bit of that. That's obviously the early parts of it where they go through all those different.
Yeah.
And the whole point of the documentaries, right, is to find all these different lawsuits that have been placed against Vince and the business. Sable's one, Martha Hart, obviously, all of the stuff with Jimmy Snuka, the steroids, all of these controversial things that we know from the periphery about. You get some details from people, and it's really interesting.
Yeah.
The last quote that I want to leave you in here, right?
It's going to be juicy.
Is Vince himself. And so they always ask everybody, when do you think Vince would retire? And pretty much everyone says no, never. John Cena says can't see it. Same as, Hogan and stuff. He'll do this until the day that he dies.
Yeah.
They ask Vince, essentially the same kind of thing. And they ask him, how would you define yourself? What would you call yourself? And Vince says, and I quote, an egomaniac, a physical culturist, someone who needs to be challenged every day, sexually active, psychologically challenged, sort of a paradox of paradoxes. So that's a lot of his...
There's a lot to unpack from that.
The part that really got me feeling icky, where he says
Sexually
active. And this, even at this point in time when they're doing the interview, is a 75-year-old Vincent K. McMahon saying how sexually... And how do you define yourself as a person? Sexually active is one of the things you define yourself as?
That's crazy. I've seen the quote about him talking about how he has 3 brains.
Yep.
And one of them is the sex brain, which is pretty much always functioning.
Yep.
And I was kind of like, that's a bit weird. That gives it a bit more context. But still, I don't like that context.
No, you don't. And I think...
I mean, good on him. Good on him for being active. Not good on him for the things that he's done, but at that age, still being active.
Consensually active, sure. Was it all consensual? Probably not.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. I mean, that's 25 minutes or so of me just highlighting some of the stories and things that you get out of this. It's 6 hours of talk. You get a lot from Vince.
Yeah.
And I think the premise out of it is, it paints him as a pretty bad guy, but I also think he is a pretty bad guy.
Yep.
I think that he can justify a lot of the things that he did throughout his career as a pure fact of the love of the business, right? He built Hulk Hogan. He created the WWF. He made it, broad. He made pay-per-view, what pay-per-view is. He is a billionaire. He went from a nothing to a millionaire to a billionaire to a 10 times billionaire, right?
Yeah.
You can't discredit what he did in terms of business and what this genre of entertainment that he has created. Can you question who the man Vince is? Yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there is so much in terms of the cover-ups, the legal lawsuits, the scandal stuff from behind the curtains that you just sit there and he answers most of it away. I think he is more uncomfortable with some, and you can definitely see there are times when he is frank and open. The steroids trial is probably the clearest one where you can tell that's Vince telling you, yeah, that's what happened. And yep, we got around it and we squeezed our way through. Yeah. And he's pretty sincere on how that goes. Some of the other things that I talk about, you can see that there is a bit of a shell over that Vince.
Right.
And it's really interesting when you can see the dichotomy of how he responds depending on what they're talking about.
Well.
And I think it was very clearly picked that a lot of the people that they had, your Hogans, your Takers, your Cenas,
Austins,
your HBKs, were all Vince guys.
Yep.
There wasn't a lot of people in there that were definitively anti-Vince.
Except for Brett.
Except for Brett. But Brett made himself look like a bit of a dick anyway.
I knew there was a reason why I didn't like Bret Hart. I knew.
Go
This
watch
cements it.
Go watch it. Tell me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong with that sort of stuff and the highlights that I picked out of it. But
Yep.
I'm interested to see maybe on our next podcast if you've got around to watching them.
Yeah, I
If your
would have watched a
opinions
few
have
by that time. Thanks for tuning in. If you've watched the Vince McMahon documentary, get in those comments. Let us know what you thought. What was your favorite part of the documentary? What wasn't? What gave you the heebie-jeebies? Let us know if you agreed with Dan and his takeaways from it. We'll see you in the next Down Under the Mat video. Guns up.